attention. My name is Dean Curry, and I teach political science here at Messiah College, also direct the college honors program. It's good to see a good crowd out this afternoon for Bryan's senior honors project presentation. And I'm delighted to have the opportunity to say a few words of introduction about Bryan. I'm assuming that all of you know Bryan in one way or another, and that's why you're here. And those of us who know Bryan know that he is an all-around great guy. And but let me be a little bit more specific than that. Bryan is carrying a double major here at Messiah College in politics with a concentration in international relations. His secondary major is psychology. He is a member of the College Honors Program, and in the fall of 2014, he spent a semester studying abroad in Oxford. In terms of extracurricular activities, a very rich and varied set of experiences, both here and abroad for Bryan. In the summer of 2013, he was a parliamentary intern in Malaysia, and I know that was a very significant experience for Bryan. He has been president of the Asian Student Association here at Messiah, and he has been involved with the Digital Harrisburg Project, which is a project of the Center for Public Humanities at the college. And also note, this is very interesting, Bryan has been involved locally with the Camp Hill chapter of Toastmasters, which is an international organization. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, that encourages and helps folks develop their public speaking skills. And we're delighted to have a representative of Toastmasters with us today. Yemi, welcome to Messiah College and Bryan's presentation. Good news for Bryan, after he's graduated, he has accepted a position, full-time position, beginning in July with Deloitte Consulting. The second piece of good news about that is that he will be headquartered locally in Camp Hill, so he will be sticking around. Now, I do have a couple of not so well known but important additional facts about Bryan. The first one he told me very few people know about, and I was really impressed by this. Back in 2011, Bryan placed 4th at the World Wing Chun Kung Fu Championship. That's for real. Here's the bottom line about that. Don't mess with Bryan. Now we know. And the other thing about Bryan you may not know, and I didn't know until a couple of days ago, being a fan myself, and I know Dr. Rigo is as well, I was happy to hear this. Bryan is a super fan of Frank Sinatra, and that's a good thing too. Well, without further ado, I will introduce Bryan. He will be addressing the topic today: institutional democracy in contemporary Malaysian society. Let's welcome Bryan.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. On the 3rd December 2015, the Malaysian Parliament passed a bill. This bill would strengthen the National Security Council of Malaysia. Now, this National Security Council is a council within the executive branch of Malaysia's government. And the passing of this bill after the Parliament was passed by the Senate. And then it was then sent to the Council of Monarchs, basically a group of 9 sultans that make up the Council of Monarchs. They vetoed this bill. Very fortunately, we would say, for all of us in Malaysia. Because should this bill have been passed, the Prime Minister will be granted unlimited power in terms of setting a curfew. The Prime Minister will be able to call a state of emergency without royal consent, ordering lockdowns, curfews, and search and seizures without warrant. Now, the Prime Minister Najib Razak, our current Prime Minister of Malaysia, cites the importance of such a bill, saying that it's to prevent terrorism or terroristic threats. However, the opposition parties in Malaysia disagree. And they say that Malaysia in the past have seen draconian laws such as these used to stifle dissent. And one very prominent opposition leader lamented saying this law will lead Malaysia down one road, and that is the road to a fascist dictatorship. Ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia, one second. There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia is the topic of my presentation today. It is located in Southeast Asia, this country, as we see on the map over here. And its peninsula is located just above Thailand and just below, just above Singapore and just below Thailand. And the two states, Sabah and Sarawak, that represent East Malaysia are located on the islands of Borneo. Malaysia is a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, and multi-religious society. As you see this graph, this pie chart over here, the Muslim population makes up 60% of Malaysia, and the Christian population a mere 10%. Malaysia is also a constitutional monarchy. It has a constitution, but also has a monarch, it has a king. And the king is selected from out of 9 of the sultans that represent 9 of 13 states. Malaysia is also it's governed by a Westminster parliamentary system, and which is not surprising since we were a former British colony, and we gained independence from the British in 1957. And Malaysia was seen as an economic powerhouse in the 1990s, up to the Asian financial crisis of 1998, which we'll talk a little bit about later as well. However, much like the weather we're having outside today, Malaysia is experiencing darker days in terms of its democracy. From fraudulent activity that mars the 2013 general election, where we see the government winning with only 47% of the popular vote. It won 60% of the seats in parliament. And the opposition with 51% of the popular vote, only 40% of the parliamentary seats. Such gerrymandering is not new, and that's not all, because if all you read the news quite recently about Malaysia, the One Malaysia Developer Berhad, or the 1MDB fiasco, we would call it, is also shown to be a scandal in Malaysia, where our Prime Minister, due to a lack of political and economic accountability, somehow has $700 million transferred from this sovereign wealth fund into his own personal bank accounts. Obviously, to this day, he denies any wrongdoing. However, this shows how shaky things are in Malaysia in terms of that. And any opposition or any party daring to question the Prime Minister has been punished in some way, shape, or form. Now, these scandals and many more I won't care to go into for the interest of time, lead many Malaysians to ask the question, so where is Malaysia going from here? And that has led me to ask the question, what are the prospects for a robust Malaysian democracy? So I'm thankful for the mentorship of Dr. Harles and also Dr. Curry. And Dr. Harles pointed me to some scholarly works that I could refer to when trying to answer this question. So I looked to the works of Robert Dahl. Now, the late Dr. Dahl was the Associate Professor of Political Science at Yale University, and he was very famous for his work on defining power. He defined power basically in a certain way. However, my focus won't be on his work of power, rather it will be on his theories of institutional democracy and on democratic pluralism. And his work that we'll examine in just a little bit will be the template for my case study on Malaysia today. So Robert Dahl talks about 3 concepts, 3 theories that I'll elaborate right now. The first is this idea of a polyarchy, or the realistic democracy. Next would be this idea of independent organizations. And lastly, government in a plural society. So let's look at the first one, the idea of a polyarchy. Okay. Now, the polyarchy, or the realistic democracy. Now, Dahl argues that a pure democracy is unattainable because it requires direct participation. And unlike today, in the olden days, in the Athenian times, people would congregate in a certain place, and they will be giving input as to how they wish or should, or how they wish they were governed, or how they ought to be governed. They provide direct input into the laws that come into place. However, in large-scale democracies like that of today, this is difficult because we cannot have everybody in a country provide direct input into how or what kind of laws should be formed, or what kind of policies that should be made. So Dahl provides the idea of a more realistic democracy. He calls it a polyarchy. And a polyarchy has 7 criteria. And we'll look at it just a little bit as well. But note that Daw's idea of a polyarchy is what we will be measuring Malaysia against today in terms of its democratic prospects. So this little chart up here shows the 7 criteria of a polyarchy. And I feel that most of them don't need much explanation. Things like having the right or having elected officials, free and fair elections, inclusive suffrage, the right to run for office, the freedom of expression, alternative information, and association autonomy. The last one may need some explanation. Basically combines a couple of these different ideas. But association autonomy basically means citizens have the right to form relatively independent organizations without the fear of being punished in some kind of way. So we can look at also the idea, so that was his first concept we were looking at. The second concept is the idea of independent organizations. Now, Dar argues that there are interest groups that exist within a polyarchy or his realistic democracy. And these interest groups may differ in size and also in power. Now, for the sake of my presentation here today, these interest groups can be defined as, or can look like political parties, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and also religious organizations. And Dar argues that they're important for mutual control, and mutual control would give then rise to sustaining a large-scale democracy. Now, I'm not sure how many of you play before that. So let's talk about mutual control, what that looks like, and what Dar means by mutual control. Not sure how many of you play the game Agario. You know, there's the one where you have little dots and you kind of use your mouse to control one around and eating other dots that are smaller than you, and then you grow bigger in size. And many of you still hopefully know what that is. But, so, Dao says that in terms of mutual control, we look at the idea of a ruler and a subject. Now, rulers can dominate weaker subjects or weak subjects. And as you can see here, the ruler is bigger than the subject, it can eat the subject if it wanted to. However, if a subject wants to avoid being dominated by a ruler, it can increase its cost, the cost of control. And Dao argues that if any ruler is moderately rational, he would kind of do a cost-benefit analysis of whether it's worthwhile trying to dominate a weaker subject. So Dao argues that subjects can increase its cost control in various ways. One way is by combining resources. As you can see, the 3 green dots down there combine and form a bigger green dot, thus disallowing the ruler to dominate it in that way. Now, we will see this idea when we look at the Malaysian opposition politics and the dynamics of that, to see how Malaysian opposition parties have combined to form coalitions to present a viable challenge to the government, to increase the cost of control. Now, so Dao also argues that this is important to sustaining a large-scale democracy because in a polyarchy, such freedom allows for independent organizations to be formed, and this, again, sustains that democracy. The last is the idea of government in plural society. So Robert Dao was a professor at Yale University. One of his most famous works is the book called Untitled Who Governs, where Robert Dao wanted to figure out where the source of political influence is in the New Haven community. So Dao had this book was an analysis of all layers of the social strata. It was an analysis of the different kinds of the different parts of the community that exist in New Haven. But Dao found that it wasn't to any specific group of people that this power belonged to. But rather, he argues that in different issues, different influential citizen groups emerge to influence these issues. And the government acts as a mediator between these various interest groups. So again, graphically, and you notice my love for, so I use paint to draw all this basically. So if it looks funny, it's because it is funny. So for any given issue, the government acts as a mediator, and so we have interest, and there are different interest groups that would kind of emerge to govern or to provide, to give influence to these specific issues. So like for issue X, we have some different groups that emerge to provide these influence. Issue Y, the same thing, so for issue Z. However, where Malaysia takes an interesting spin in terms of this theory is that the government is also an interest group within the group of interest groups there. The government is both a mediator now and a minority. It is a mediator and an interest group at the same time. And we'll see this more specifically in some instances later in this presentation. Now, so Dao's theory, it plays out, so Dao's theories here, they apply in different ways in Malaysia. But before we get into his theory specifically, how to interact with instances of Malaysian politics, it's important to ask the question, or it's important to ask whether it is rational, whether it is prudent to be comparing Malaysia to a liberal democracy, or whether we should be talking about applying a liberal democracy to Malaysia. So hence, I'd ask the question, why not an Asian democracy for Malaysia? The two gentlemen in the picture here, one is Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, the fourth Prime Minister of Malaysia, and the other gentleman on the right is Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, the first Prime Minister of Singapore. Both these gentlemen were proponents of the Asian democracy. And what is an Asian democracy? Well, basically it is a pseudo-democracy, because it is democracy laced with hints of authoritarianism. And Barisan Nasional, the ruling coalition in Malaysia, the government basically, under Dr. Mahathir, practiced this kind of limited democracy as a means of stifling anarchy, Dr. Mahathir used to say. And for 22 years, Dr. Mahathir demanded obedience for his authority under Barisan Nasional. And this stifled political dissent very much, and thus freedom of expression. This was most clearly seen in the removal of his deputy prime minister at the time, Anwar Ibrahim. And Dr. Mahathir sacked Anwar Ibrahim as deputy prime minister in the heat of the Asian financial crisis of 1998 for a very simple reason. So Anwar wanted to restore investor confidence in Malaysia, to bring back foreign investments again to Malaysia, and he wanted to do so by eliminating corruption, cronyism, and nepotism that was so prevalent under Dr. Mahathir's rule. Dr. Mahathir saw this as a personal attack against him and his allies, and decided to, and both Dr. Mahathir and his allies have been benefiting very much from this well-oiled machine of patronage power. And because of that, decided to sack Anwar from his position as deputy prime minister, and charge him with, and Anwar was charged with for sodomizing his male aide. And under Islamic law, sodomy is a very punishable crime. Anwar was imprisoned for 6 years. However, Anwar to this day maintains that he did not commit such an act. So under Dr. Mahathir's strict controls, there was clearly a lack of political accountability and also the rule of law. And the remnants of such a lack are evident in Malaysia today. We see this in the 1MDB scandal I described earlier, also the various election frauds that we'll talk about later as well. And Malaysians everywhere are calling for reform. So with these, perhaps dabbling in the idea of a polyarchy might prove a remedy to this, which is why we're examining Daw's idea of a polyarchy today. So we talked about the three theories just now. So we're going to look at the first one, the idea of independent organizations and that of mutual control. So to do this, we can look at various events in Malaysian history, ranging from the year 1998 to 2013. We'll examine 3 of them. The first is the Reformist Movement of 1998. Now, Reformasi is Malay for reform. And this all started after the Deputy Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim was removed from office. And this created this surge for reform. All Malaysians in that year they were clamoring for reform of the government. So many independent organizations joined this reform here. However, these organizations had varying ideologies as to what this reform meant. And because they had competing ethnic and religious ideologies, and it surfaced when all of these NGOs and political parties made their stands during the movement, each had their own ideas of how Reformasi would affect Malaysia. And despite this being an opposition or being a movement that opposed the government, some parties thought that the Reformasi movement meant enlarging of democratic rights and equality, as well as the alleviation of income disparities in the nation's society. However, others thought that Reformasi meant justice for the imprisoned Anwar Ibrahim and the eradication of cronyism, corruption, and nepotism. And for Islamic movements in Malaysia, it meant the expansion of Islam's presence and its role in society. So we see a lack of cohesion here among all these various opposition groups, NGOs, and also political parties. And this lack of cohesion between these groups caused what was initially a powerful movement to lose steam over time because they shared little consensus as to what Reformasi meant. So this wasn't the first time that happened in history, because just the next year, as the Malaysian opposition formed a coalition for the first time in Malaysian history. As you see up here in the picture to the left, we have 4 parties that formed the opposition coalition in 1999. And this opposition coalition was called Barisan Alternatif, or the Alternative Front. A play on words because the ruling coalition's name was the National Front. So Keadilan, or the Justice Party, came together with DAP, the Democratic Action Party, the Pan Malaysian Islamic Party, or PAS, and also the Parti Rakyat Malaysia, or the Malaysian People's Party. They formed the first coalition in Malaysia to present this challenge to the government. So we see here Dow's idea again of how they've combined their resources to present, to increase the cost control against the government, and that is the government decided here, the National Front. However, it was again because of competing ideologies, and PAS, an Islamic party, wanted to realize a theocracy in Malaysia and an Islamic state. And this ideology clashed with that of the Secular Democratic Action Party, that was obviously a secular party, had no interest in that of developing an Islamic state in Malaysia. So this spat between DAP, the rocket symbol up there, and PAS, the green flag with the white dot, led to DAP leaving the coalition in 2001. So that's the first instance again. We see how after they've combined resources, right now it was interesting because for Malaysia, this religious thread in Malaysia had caused this to disband. Next, we look at the opposition coalitions of 2008. So after DAP left, and in 2008, the coalition was formed again. So why was it this time that DAP chose to come back with PAS, this Islamic party? It was very simple. In 2005, there was new leadership in PAS. The president then, Aziz Nikmat, was seen as a more moderate Muslim, and this was appealing to DAP. So DAP, PAS, and Keadilan, now known as Parti Keadilan Rakyat, PKR, all formed this coalition again in 2008. And this coalition was led by Anwar Ibrahim in the picture over here. Now in 2008, this coalition accomplished very much during their time. In 2008, the coalition deprived the ruling coalition, this opposition coalition, deprived the ruling coalition of their 2/3 supermajority in parliament, and thus the ability to amend the constitution with impregnable certainty. In 2013 again, they led the opposition to its biggest victory in Malaysian history. 51% of the popular vote went to the opposition, despite the fact that they only garnered 40% of the seats in parliament, which points again to gerrymandering, which we'll discuss later as well. However, some years after the 2013 election, the past president, Aziz Nikmat, in the picture over here, all the way to the left, he passed away, sadly, 2 years after the election. And this gave rise to PAS's more conservative, more right-wing leader, Hadi Awang. Now, Hadi Awang pushed for Islamic laws in various PAS-controlled states. Things like separate checkout counters for men and women in some states. Also, how buildings in that state had to resemble a mosque in some way, shape, or form. And this again led to a spat between DAP and PAS, again causing, this time, PAS to leave the coalition in 2015. So once more we see this again, how after the combining of resources, these opposition parties, this religious threat caused them to disband again once more. Next is, we can talk about Dow's idea of a pluralist democracy, basically how governments act as mediators between interest groups that emerge to influence a specific issue. However, as we said before, the Malaysian government in this case acts as both a mediator and a fellow minority. Now, I must first give a little bit of historic context for Malaysia. Malaysia is a country that's governed, it has affirmative action laws. They safeguard the special position of the Malays, or of the ethnic Malays. So there are quotas in civil service employment and also in education for ethnic Malays. And these are guaranteed by the Constitution. Now in the governing coalition, that is Barisan Nasional, there are 13 parties. When the coalition first began, there were 3 main ethnic parties because that was how the government decided to divide their parties by an ethnic base. So there was an ethnic Malay party, UMNO, an ethnic Indian party, MIC, or the Malaysian Indian Congress, and the ethnic Chinese party, MCA. Now, today, UMNO's strength in parliament is unrivaled compared to all these other minority parties, as we might call them. And being the representative for ethnic Malays, UMNO's strength in parliament may suggest a tendency to focus on issues concerning ethnic Malays. And unlike Dow's theory, the government clearly has a horse in the race concerning various issues. It is the fellow minority because, again, of the government's ethnic-based party structures. So let's examine some instances where this shows to be the case. The first one, we can look at the Allah controversy. In 2007, the Malaysian Ministry of Home Affairs threatened to withdraw the publishing license of the Catholic Church newspaper called the Herald if it didn't stop using the word Allah to describe the Christian God. Now, this was done on the grounds of national security and public order, and this ministry cited that the Muslims in Malaysia might be confused in their worship should Christians continue to use the word Allah in their publications. This case was brought to court after a huge controversy and a lot of racial tension, a lot of racial and religious tension, and a lower court ruled in favor of the Herald, and they were therefore allowed again to use the word Allah. However, the government appealed this decision. And after the government's appealing of this decision, it was brought to an appeals court that then ruled in favor of the government, thus banning the Herald from using the word Allah in any of their publications. So again, we see how the government clearly has a horse in the race once more. And not only that, no government action was taken against right-wing Malay activists that during the heat of all this had committed arson and had propagated racist propaganda. The picture in the bottom left here on the slide shows a church that was hit by petrol bombs that these right-wing activists had thrown. No action was taken against these groups. However, action was taken against opposition members of parliament and NGOs that had opposed or that were protesting this government decision to appeal that of the court. So again, we see how the government has a horse in the race once more. And that's just a slide describing that. Now, second, we look at JAKIM. So JAKIM is the Department of Malaysian Islamic Development. And this is, again, part of it is a federal branch, it's part of the ruling coalition. And it has ties with the ruling coalition and with UMNO as well. Now, this issue concerns advertising during the election season. So this Department of Malaysian Islamic Development, close ties with, again, Barisan Nasional and UMNO. They disseminated pro-government propaganda in national sermons during election season. Now this, obviously the opposition cannot rival this because the opposition, as we'll see later, has virtually no airtime on TV during election season. Now, JAKIM disseminating these sermons had sermons sermon titles identical to sections in the government election manifesto. Things like "Be loyal and grateful to BM leaders or the government." And obviously the opposition could not compete with this as well, again showing how the government has such ties with these various groups. So now we can look at Dow's Polyarchy and Malaysia. So we've examined the first two theories here. The third now we'll look at how Malaysia stacks up compared to Dow's Polyarchy. So as you can see, Malaysia is home to, So Malaysia lacks in four areas in terms of Dow's Polyarchy. That are free and fair elections, freedom of expression, alternative information, and association autonomy. So we look at the dot to the top right, how Malaysia has no free and fair elections. Gerrymandering is a huge issue in Malaysia. As I mentioned before, 47% of the government's popular vote translates to 60% of parliamentary seats. Also, there are cases of phantom voters. And we see, and this was very clearly seen in 2008 and also somewhere in 2013, where in Malaysia's electoral system, in their electoral roll, there were people who simply did not exist. People aged 120 years old, people that were not even born. There were 40 names registered to one single home address. So all these people did not exist, and people suspect that the government had been using these phantom voters to gain more votes in the election. And lastly also is the case of faulty indelible ink. In the most recent election, the government paid a lot of money to have indelible ink painted on each voter's finger as a means of preventing multiple voting. So this ink, this indelible ink, was supposed to stay on your finger for at least a week. Even my mom, who after voting came back and easily washed off this indelible ink with simple soap and water. So this is important, not only because it shows the incompetence of the authorities that were in charge of getting this ink, but also that of, in a larger picture, that of the election. Many of the parliamentary seats were won with a majority margin of less than 5%. So we can ask now, what would happen then if someone just went and voted again and again and again? That may have swung the vote considerably in favor of whoever it was supposed to be in favor of. So that is free and fair elections. Now let's look at freedom of expression and also alternative information, how both of these are suppressed. So as I mentioned before, the opposition has virtually no media airtime during election season. And also, and this is very unfortunate because in my research here, I refer a lot to this one news site called the Malaysian Insider, where I got a lot of very extensive and objective information, at least I feel. And recently, the Malaysian Insider was forced to close simply because of commercial reasons. They were forced to close. And this only began happening after their extensive reporting on the 1MDB fiasco. Suspensions were placed on them by the government, and they had to start this very comprehensive process of layoffs. And this, in the end, and after the loss of a lot of advertising, they were forced to shut down. So a lot of my sources today in my thesis cannot be viewed because this publication no longer exists. Now the last is warning of protest participation. So Malaysians are always warned by the government not to participate in pro-reform protests. And I have friends who are abroad on government scholarships who were warned that if they were found to have participated in such protests, their scholarships would be revoked. All this translates to the stifling of freedom of expression that we see so clearly in Malaysia. And last but not least, here we have how Malaysia is lacking association autonomy. So we saw the idea of affirmative action as played out in Malaysia, how the government is biased against the interests of other ethnicities and other religions for that of the Muslim Malays, and that we have seen before as well. So is there hope for Malaysia at this point? As you can see, Malaysia is home to a complex mix of religious and ethnic nuances that can easily escalate to political turmoil. And it seems that Malaysia's best chance of attaining Dawes polyarchy will be to focus on transparency and political accountability. And for this, we can look to the Penang state. Now, we have many Malaysians in the house today, but I'm not sure if anyone here is from Penang specifically. Is anyone from Penang? Oh, I do. Yeah, okay. Ms. Lee has spent some time in Penang. So now, the Penang state, I would say, is sort of a ray of hope for Malaysia at this point. Because up to 2008, since independence, Penang had been ruled by the governing coalition. In 2008, the opposition took over, and they decided to implement a governing philosophy, that of competency, accountability, and transparency. And it's proved to be very effective. So on this slide here, this big arrow points to where Penang is. It's a very small island state of Malaysia. That's a picture of the coast of Penang, a very beautiful place indeed. And now the Penang state its chief minister reported how in 5 years after taking over from the government, in 5 years, it gained a budget surplus of $105 million with this governing philosophy with this clean governing philosophy. And this is compared to the ruling coalition's government, or its former government of Penang, where in 50 years they had only made $87 million of a surplus. So the Chief Minister, Lim Guan Eng of Penang, argues that at a federal level, if this was done the same at a federal level, we could achieve such results as well. Now, Dawes polyarchy definitely provides a template to examine Malaysia. But it's clear that Malaysia's complex religious and ethnic dynamics take an interesting spin on Dawes theories of independent organizations and also of pluralism. Democracies are not built overnight, and Malaysia is a clear uphill climb. The recent passing of the National Security Council, while it was vetoed by the Council of Monarchs, does pose a dictatorial threat to the country that has seen constant use of draconian sedition laws to stifle challenges against the government. Ambitions of greater democratic prospects rest on the gentle deliberation of ethnic and racial tensions, or even more so in pursuing political accountability and transparency. and respecting the rule of law. Thank you.
We have time for questions.
You discuss a desire for a more robust democracy, but in the bill that would have allowed for the Prime Minister to take control, you said the Council of Monarchs was the whole reason why it was vetoed.
Sure.
How is that an example of a more robust democracy, or is this just an undemocratic body acting in its own self-interest and promoting democracy as a byproduct?
That's a good question. So the Council of Monarchs, basically, as I mentioned, is the group of sultans that vetoed this bill. So in Malaysia, I would say the monarchs actually have the final say in this sense. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but the monarchs do have this final say. They have like this vetoing power. Sorry, does that answer your question?
But is that a more robust democracy? Isn't
Not-
that an
not entirely.
undemocratic
Not entirely.
system?
So I mean, in this sense, I would say. So in this sense, I would say the democracy here is, yeah. In this case, I'll argue it definitely is stifled in this sense. Yeah.
I just want to add to your slide where the arsonist, where the church was burned down. Just for added information, Romans 8:28, God works together for good to all who love Him and are called according to His purpose. This church finally got their license to build a bigger building. They had applied for the license for 12 years, and the government had rejected them over and over again. After the incident when the Christian group got together and was really upset, they approved the license, and today it's a beautiful big church. And I want to give glory to God. God can work in difficult situations.
For sure.
Hi, Brian. So a minor question, then maybe a bigger one. The minor one is that the gerrymandering thing that you bring up, and maybe you talked about this in your senior sum paper, and I've forgotten. But Malaysia has first past the post, right? Single-member plurality system.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And single-member plurality systems are notorious for having those outcomes. So in what sense can you speak to it being gerrymandering as opposed to just the mathematical byproduct of that election system? That's the first. The second question is that institutions are important to democracy, but they're not the only things that are important. Part of the cultural proclivity for democratic values is also important. And so I'm wondering if you could comment about that. That's to say, what is the sort of the enthusiasm of the Malaysian people themselves for the sorts of changes that you're suggesting?
Sure. I'll take the bigger question first. So in Malaysia, there is, I mean, all this has been ruled by the governing coalition. And until recent years, I would say, especially after a growing middle class, a growing size of the middle class, I think that has truly led to its interest now in seeking an alternative to the government. And so far, the Malaysian opposition has been the only opposition and has provided such an alternative to government. Sorry, so could you repeat your first question again?
The first question is that first past the post electoral systems typically have these distorting effects between the percentage of vote that you get in the country and the percentage of seats that you wind up with in the legislature.
Sure.
I guess my question is how much of the inequity that you're mentioning is simply a byproduct of that, the mathematical peculiarities of that system of voting, as opposed to actually people drawing electoral districts that are favorable to the government?
Sure. I would say, I'm actually not, my research didn't cover very extensively on that particular area, but I will say that it does have some effect as into, so I mean gerrymandering, this has been a big issue in Malaysia, gerrymandering obviously, and for the longest time actually, for the past 2 or 3 elections, I've seen in my research, it shows that the government had been redrawing to redelineate more seats to some specific constituencies. And that gives it made it easier for places where the ruling coalition where they had a stronger base and to win in that sense. I'm not sure this answers your question.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
So you mentioned that the state of Penang acts as a ray of hope for Malaysia, and that it went into the hands of the opposition party in 2008. as we know, Selangor, which is the richest state in Malaysia, is under rule by the People's Justice Party, which is also part of the opposition. Can you comment on that a little bit in terms of, we see Penang with the governance of DAP coming out with a surplus of over 100 million in just 5 short years. Can you comment on whether Malaysians can have confidence in the People's Justice Party with the state of Selangor, and in the future, whether Malaysia as a whole can see confidence in the opposition government?
Sure. I mean, that's true, and you bring a very good point, because actually Selangor is also one of the states that's shown to have a very strong surplus. It is picking up, not as quickly as Penang, but definitely is picking up. However, for Selangor, there are a couple of different dynamics, because they're not running on a very specific kind of governing philosophy like Penang is. And very recently, there was something called the Kajang, where Anwar Ibrahim wanted to run again forward to be the chief minister of Selangor. Unfortunately, that didn't work out too well again because of a lot of controversy and whatnot. But again, a little different from Penang, but I would say Selangor is heading in that same direction as well.
I have a question that's a little bit unrelated, but not really. What difference did it make that you were doing this work here in this setting? I guess not just your classes, but how did you see things differently that you might not have seen as you were working on the same thing in Malaysia?
Sure. I would actually want to say that I probably got more, greater sources in Malaysia. Here I was limited to what I saw on the media, news articles, journals, but in Malaysia, especially with my parliamentary internship before, with these connections, I would have got more information of that sort. But during the time I was doing this, that office was very busy. I didn't have much access to them as well. So it was stifled this way. However, it was interesting to get the perspective from being a student here as I was conducting this research. I would say. So,
One more, only because other people aren't going to speak. So the government coalition, right? It's dominated by the 3 oldest parties, is that right, within the coalition?
Oh, right, you mean the ruling coalition?
The ruling coalition, yeah.
Yes, it is.
Okay. In some cases, coalition governments are held captive by actually quite minor parties who are necessary to their parliamentary majorities. The most egregious example is Israel, right, where the extreme parties actually drive the government agenda in some respects. Can you talk about at all those smaller aspects of the coalition? Do they really have autonomy? Are they independent forces, or do they simply accede to the wishes of the biggest party in the coalition?
Actually, because of this religious threat, this religious and ethnic threat. Now in Malaysia, if you are a Malay, an ethnic Malay, you are automatically a Muslim. You're born into Islam as a Malay, and Malaysia is, as I say, majority Malay country. And even in that coalition itself, we see the main 3 ethnic parties, the biggest being the Malay one. But within that 13 other, those 10 other minority parties, and you're right to say so because there are many right-wing Islamic parties, that this Malay party, that this dominant one, kind of has, is subjected to also the influence of these minor parties as well. And that definitely plays into all kinds of issues in Malaysian politics.
So presumably to hold power, they might have to indulge those parties, and things could actually get worse.
Perhaps, yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Perhaps.
On the opposite side of that question, this is more just for clarification as an American who doesn't know much about Malaysian politics, but the opposition party, at least until recently, it sounded like it was made up by some very awkward bedfellows with the secular party and the Muslim party. So is the goal just to stop action of the government, or to actually set forth an alternative possibility for governance?
That's a good question. I would say it's actually both. And partly because, and again, with all that changing dynamics of leadership, we saw the death of Nik Aziz Nikmat and the rise of Hadi Awang, and these things change from time to time. So during that period, that season itself, PAS became a very viable option in DAP. And even today, after PAS left, some defectors of PAS, the Islamic party, now actually formed a new party called Parti Amanah. and they are the new Islamic party that is still part of the coalition that governs it with more moderate philosophy.
Malaysia has had a relatively short history, but nonetheless sizable, about 50 years. Could you, based on observing the history of how Malaysia has been governed and so forth, is there a time that you could point to where the government actually stepped in as a, how would you say, a stakeholder in terms of Dahl's model earlier, where
Sure.
you mentioned over and over again that the government has a horse in the race.
Right.
Is there a time that you could see a clear stepping into, so to speak?
Right. So I'm referring to besides the Awak controversy and Joaquin as well.
I'm thinking of earlier in Malaysia's history.
Oh, early in industry.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my research in this case, it covered mostly these contemporary issues that range from, especially past the Asian financial crisis up to today. So unfortunately, I can't speak too much about the any much earlier events that happened in Malaysian history, unfortunately. Sorry.
One thing that struck me in Malaysia is that there almost seems to be a shadow oligarchical government that's in place, and you have more of a civil government in place. Same with judicial systems, right? You really have kind of two judicial systems. I am curious, with the voting electorate, civil government, compared to the Council of Sultans, how do those power dynamics really play out in the real world?
Sure. I would say it's actually very vague. And I'll give an example. Just even, if you ask, and it's quite unfortunate, if you ask me, I actually couldn't tell you what the name of our Sultan was. And I'm sure it's quite true of many of the Malaysians. There is this divide, definitely, in the understanding of the power that plays out in terms of these dynamics. But whenever issues like these arise, we start to see how they actually do, in this case, not very well.
So building off of that, and the question that Jeffrey asked at the beginning, so this Council of Sultans vetoed a bill that was a threat to democratic values and fundamental rights. Does that suggest the possibility of a counter-majoritarian or an anti-majoritarian, anti-democratic institution like that council as being necessary to help create a more robust democracy? I'm thinking as a point of comparison to like the role that the Supreme Court has played in our system, where it's expanded associational, First Amendment, free expression rights, fundamental rights associated with political power, even though it's the most undemocratic, least accountable branch of our government. So is there hope in some of these more authoritarian or anti-democratic institutions?
I'll have to say yes, because actually the Council of Monarchs, when they vetoed, but I think this was a mere 2 months ago, and people were quite surprised actually at their actions, because and from what I've read from our research, it shows that the Council of Monarchs took the time to actually listen to what the people were feeling. There was a lot of, in terms of the electorate or the electorate themselves, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with this bill. So, and it showed, and I was surprised that the Council of Monarchs had taken this into account, because normally they don't really do that.
So to continue up on Dr. Rigo, is it surprising that they vetoed it? Because it seems like they would be ceding power to the government if they allowed the draconian ministerial government to take control in times of crisis. So is it really them looking after the people, or is it them looking after their own powers?
Great question. Maybe both, actually. And again, this power would grant the Prime Minister, it would be basically up to the Prime Minister to decide these curfews, these lockdowns, these social procedures, renewable at his own discretion. So I would guess the advisors to the sultans were advised against it, which does provide a good balance, a check and balance, even though we've hardly seen this action from the sultans before in the past.
One more question? Okay, please jump in.
So with scandals like the 1MDB scandal and other instances of corruption in Malaysia that are so rampant and that is so that has gotten so much coverage internationally and domestically, I'm wondering if when the Constitution was made out during Malaysia's founding, if there were any provisions for check and balances in the institution of government.
Sure. I would say my research didn't cover the constitution specifically, so I can't speak exactly to that. My guess is that they probably were, but again, so in Malaysia there were ethnic riots in the year 1969, and this was due to the dissatisfaction of Malays at the Chinese population because they were largely dominating the economic sphere. So there was a growing Chinese middle and upper class and an even bigger Malay lower class. So I guess to answer your question, the economic policies that were in place after that had led to these affirmative action. All these affirmative action laws, and in turn these laws, now that they were in place, had continued to sustain this position of the Malays, making it easy to, I would say, somewhat to get away with these corruptions or these corrupt practices.
Another question? Great question, by the way. Bryan, thank you very much for an informative and insightful presentation. Thanks to all of you for coming. Have a good evening.